Welcome back to US History Lecture Videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Today we're going to be talking about the post-World War II Civil Rights Movement. So kind of talking about the Civil Rights Movement in the period of 1945 to 1956. Specifically, by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to explain how Presidents Truman and Eisenhower addressed civil rights issues, discuss the efforts by African Americans to end discrimination and segregation, and describe the Southern white people's response to the Civil Rights Movement. So after World War II ended, African Americans returned home expecting greater rights and freedoms. Many had fought in the Double V campaign to defeat enemies abroad while fighting segregation at home, but despite their sacrifices, the U.S. was not willing to extend them greater rights than before the war. So this period marks the beginning of organized resistance to racial discrimination throughout the country. African Americans used legal challenges, grassroots activism, and protesting to dismantle nearly 100 years of segregation, trying to prove that it's unequal. During World War II, African Americans believed that their military service would earn them equal rights and opportunities after the war, but when they returned home and discovered that their sacrifices had not changed the system, they were very frustrated. Although they were legally entitled to GI Bill benefits, discriminatory practices prevented them from using them. Banks refused to give mortgages to Black veterans wanting to buy homes in African American neighborhoods. Real estate groups and covenants prevented property owners from selling to Black families in white neighborhoods. When a Black family tried to purchase a Levittown house, they faced harassment and threats of violence in this white neighborhood in 1957. So racial discrimination is actually at an all-time high. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the major events of the Civil Rights Movement. In 1944, a woman named Irene Morgan, an African American woman, was arrested in Virginia for refusing to give up her bus seat. She sued to have her conviction overturned, which took her case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court when they ruled in her favor. The court held her conviction violated the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution. This emboldened civil rights activists to launch the Journey of Reconciliation, which was a bus trip by 8 African American men and 8 white men through the Upper South. In 1948, the Supreme Court case Shelley versus Kramer addressed racial housing discrimination. It challenged real estate covenants that restricted property sales based on race. And the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the courts could not enforce these discriminatory covenants. And this decision was huge because it removed legal backing for housing segregation, which still continued through other sneaky means and loopholes, but it was the beginning of actually outlawing it. Whereas before, there was nothing to stop you from putting in a clause in your neighborhood that said Black people can't live here, right? That sort of blatant, obvious discrimination was now illegal, and people still discriminated, but they had to be sneakier about it. Many banks and real estate agents still refused to work with Black families, and segregated neighborhoods remained the reality, even though this was a good legal victory. In 1950, the NAACP brought Sweatt versus Painter before the U.S. Supreme Court. All right, it's probably Sweet. Not 100% sure how to pronounce this last name. We're gonna call it Sweatt for the sake of today. So Sweatt sued the University of Texas for denying him admission to law school. State law prohibited integrated education until Texas tried to create a separate law school for African Americans, and the Supreme Court said this was unconstitutional. This court held that the separate school provided neither equal facilities nor important intangibles. So basically, the education would not be equal by creating a tiny separate law school. And so this began to undermine previous cases that had said separate could be equal. So this is where we see during this time period the shift and the reality of separate being unequal being brought to the forefront, challenging that separate but equal. No, it's really not. The separation was in fact not equal at all. And oftentimes there wasn't an alternative option to the white option. We also see socially people begin to break the color barrier in sports. Jackie Robinson starts playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers and was the first African American to play in the National League, breaking the color barrier in baseball. And even though African Americans had had their own team, Robinson opened the doors to major league competition, which had not been open to African Americans before. So this led to African American athletes challenging segregation in other American sports. At the 1948 Summer Olympics, a woman named Alice Coachman won a gold medal in track and field, and she was the only American woman to win gold at those games. So these were small cracks, but the beginning of cracks in the wall of segregation. One of the huge cases was Brown versus Board of Education. Until 1954, racial segregation in education was required in 17 states and allowed in others. With a landmark case, Brown versus Board of Education is going to shatter this. Okay, the case was heard before the U.S. Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren. Thurgood Marshall was the chief counsel arguing this case, and he used evidence from sociological studies that showed segregation in public schools made African American students feel inferior. And this Supreme Court ruled that even if facilities were equal, separating students by race was unconstitutional. And this was the huge landmark case that overturned separate but equal. So now things had to be desegregated. The court ordered that Southern school systems begin being desegregated with all deliberate speed. And so this was a huge, huge shift in thinking, where the U.S. Supreme Court is saying, look, apparently separate is not equal. And even if it was, it causes trauma to force them to be separated. No more separation. Whites and blacks are going to go to school together. Enforcing this was really, really difficult. Really, really difficult. And we're going to talk a little bit about one of the key events that happened. Little Rock 9 refers to 9 African American students who tried to go to a previously all-white school in Little Rock, Arkansas. The Arkansas governor was called out the state National Guard to prevent the students from attending. Okay, so you have the U.S. federal national government saying segregation needs to end. We're desegregating schools. You must allow black and white children to go to school together. Then you have the governor of an entire state pulling the National Guard to prevent that from happening. Soldiers turned away a 15-year-old who was followed and threatened by white adults. These children were spat on, their lives were threatened, mob violence, right? There was angry people screaming hate things at them while they were trying to go to school. And so the president had to step in, take control of the state branch of the National Guard, put it under federal control, and send out the U.S. Army to escort these children to and from school. This was the first time since the Reconstruction period after the Civil War that federal troops protected African American rights. Throughout the year, the Little Rock 9 students were insulted, harassed, and physically assaulted, but continued to come back each day. And there's some really interesting documentaries out there if you want to kind of hear what they experienced. So school segregation was not just a Southern issue, it also existed in northern cities like New York City. New York City schools that served black students had significant deficiencies in resources and teacher quality. They were not equal, even though they were separate. So the Harlem 9 was a group of 9 mothers who filed suit and kept their children out of school because they protested that their education for their African American children was inadequate and unequal. The mothers asked for an open transfer policy to send children to schools outside their districts. They received heavy, heavy fighting against this by city officials and local media, declaring that the moms were unfit parents. But the Harlem 9 eventually won the right to transfer their children. So we now see the U.S. government on the side of desegregation for the first time in U.S. history rather than on the side of segregation. The local court in New York City Board of Education was forced to declare that segregation existed in city schools. And so by admitting that it was happening, step 1 to desegregating. But there was a lot of resistance, okay? Many white people met this Brown versus Board decision of desegregation with horror and organized resistance. Some World War II veterans questioned how the government they fought for could betray them. White parents took their children out of public schools and enrolled them in all-white private academies, which were often created solely to keep white children away from integrated schools. Classes were even held in neighbors' basements or living rooms, anything to avoid desegregation. Some Southern school districts responded by closing all public schools rather than integrating them, which specifically was discriminatory against African Americans who could not afford to send their children to private schools where the white families could. So then one county in Virginia closed its public schools for 5 years to avoid integration. And so as a consequence of desegregation, the children just missed 5 whole years of education if they were black children. So we had huge, huge opposition to the civil rights movement. And we see this continuing in forms of violence and terror. There was a murder of a boy named Emmett Till. 14-year-old Emmett Till was from Chicago and was vacationing with relatives in Mississippi. He made a remark to a white woman behind the counter, and a few days later, that woman's husband and brother abducted him in the middle of the night, beat him, mutilated him, murdered him, and threw his body into the river. Emmett Till's mother insisted on an open casket funeral to reveal how brutal Southern racism was. And the murder of a child guilty of nothing more than a casual remark admitted the nation. The two men who admitted to killing him were acquitted and let go by the jury. They got away with it. And this tragedy is going to inspire many, many people to continue fighting for civil rights. If you can murder an innocent boy and get away with it, things really needed to change. So we start seeing more boycotts. For example, the Montgomery bus boycott. Segregated buses forced African Americans to ride in the back. Black passengers had to enter through the rear and could not share seats with white passengers and had to give up their seats when requested. The bus company refused to hire African American drivers, even though most of the riders were black. On December 1st, 1955, a woman named Rosa Parks protested by refusing to give her seat to a white man. She was arrested, but decided to fight the segregation laws in court. News spread through newspapers and word of mouth, and people rallied behind her. 40,000 African American riders did not take the bus on December 5th, the first day of the boycott. And this is where we see the beginning of Martin Luther King Jr. begin to rise. He was a young minister at the time, embracing and maintaining the boycott far beyond Rosa Parks' court date. So this was a form of unified protest to avoid the bus entirely and gain national attention, bring attention to the racist events that were happening. By exposing them to the light, you could begin to address the problems. So for 381 days, the black residents of Montgomery avoided the city's buses in an organized protest. Some organized carpools, some paid for rides in African American owned taxis, and most walked everywhere for the duration of this more than year-long protest. And in June of 1956, an Alabama federal court found the segregation ordinance unconstitutional. Federal court, okay? The city tried to appeal this, but the Supreme Court upheld it. So we see a lot of battling between the national government and the state governments. The states do not want to desegregate. The federal government is forcing them to. And as a result, often after the desegregation laws were put into place, there would be a wave of violence in the South from angry white citizens who did not want or believe that desegregation should take place. They believe that it should be separate. And then they would fight back in various violent forms. The Montgomery bus boycott demonstrated the power of nonviolent resistance in being organized, working together as a group, and it also launched Martin Luther King Jr. to national attention as a civil rights leader. All right, so that's it for today. Just a few key victories and resistance to desegregation. So we just see the beginning of desegregation, right? Remember, the federal government is outlawing segregation and saying you have to, especially in education. Right now, the children need to go to school together, and people were so set against this. You have things like a county in Virginia just shutting down all schools for 5 years, saying, well, if you won't let us keep our schools separate, then we're going to just shut down every public school, and the white children can afford to go to the private schools, and the black children are the ones who suffer by lacking an education for 5 years, right? You can just think about the long-term effects that had on those kids. That's 5 whole years of not going to school. Huge. So lots and lots of resistance to the civil rights movement.